Welcome to the Feminist Park podcast. I'm Kwame.
And I'm Leilani. It's great to be kicking off this journey with you all today.
Yeah, we're diving into work that's really closely tied to the vision behind the Feminist Park project.
Imagining these truly equitable public spaces, starting with the idea for an intersectional feminist park right here in Berlin.
Exactly. And this podcast, well, it's kind of an extension of that. We're going to be digging into the academic research that, supports and informs that kind of vision.
We'll be taking these dense, sometimes quite academic papers and really pulling out the core and insights.
And looking at them through specific lenses, things like environmental justice, intersectionality, anti-colonial thought, queer theory.
All the stuff that helps us think critically about space. The moment you step out of an air-conditioned building onto a city street in summer, you feel it. That oppressive, smothering blanket of heat radiating off the asphalt, reflecting off the glass towers. For decades, we filed that away as just, an inconvenience, of physical discomfort that's just part of modern city life.
A necessary evil, almost.
Exactly. But what if that feeling of stifling, draining heat wasn't just bad for your physical body, but was actively chipping away at your mental health, while also acting as this cruel mechanism that disproportionately hits the most vulnerable people in the city? Okay, let's unpack this. We're staring down what can only be described as the invisible crisis of urban heat. We know cities generate heat islands, but our sources today reveal that this heat is a massive systemic threat to our psychological well-being.
And critically to social justice.
Yes. Fundamentally.
Yeah.
We were talking about city design translating directly into mental distress and, perhaps even more shockingly, into displacement.
That's a crucial framework. Our deep dive today moves far beyond simply measuring the urban heat island effect, or UHI. We're analyzing two powerful academic sources that demand we confront this link between our built environment and our psychological state.
And they reveal this profound paradox.
A profound paradox. How investing in cooling infrastructure, the very solutions we need, can inadvertently trigger the socio-physical displacement of the people the investments were meant to protect. This mechanism, it's called climate gentrification.
So the solution becomes part of the problem.
It can, if we're not careful. Our mission today is a rigorous synthesis of these two sources. We have Peter Crank and Paul Casello's theoretical review, Cityscapes, Climate, and Mental Health, Designing Cities for Thermal Well-Being.
All right.
This piece is essential because it gives us that scientific foundation. It links specific urban climate design choices or, failures to measurable psychological outcomes.
So that's the theory. What's the other piece?
Then we pair that theoretical grounding with a highly empirical study by Calderon-Argalish and colleagues. It's called Co-Mapping Vulnerability to Climate Gentrification in the Context of Urban Heat. And it focuses on this fascinating participatory vulnerability mapping in Barcelona.
Barcelona, which is a huge heat hotspot.
Like the extremely heat-vulnerable metropolitan region. So we get the theory and the real-world application.
Our goal for you, the listener, is to synthesize these findings and give you a clear, actionable understanding of what equitable and resilient urban spaces must look like. This is knowledge we have to apply immediately as we think about designing truly liberatory public spaces, like the feminist park concept. The underlying truth here is that you cannot design for justice unless you actively design for thermal justice and against displacement.
That's it. That's a whole ball game.
Okay, let's start by establishing the scientific groundwork. The Crank and Casello review, it immediately reframes the core problem.
It does. They argue that hot urban landscapes are not merely an unavoidable act of nature, but rather they're human-magnified disasters.
Human-magnified disasters. I like that. It puts the agency back on us.
Exactly. They borrow this philosophical shift from the 1930s from a geographer named Gilbert White. White insisted that, say, the social impacts of flooding shouldn't be seen as this inevitable result of a natural hazard,
but as a consequence of human choices.
Yes. Like building on floodplains, Crank and Casello ask us to apply that exact same lens to heat. When a dense urban neighborhood becomes lethally hot, it's not just the sun's fault.
It's the fault of the concrete, the lack of tree canopy, the centuries of planning failure.
Precisely.
And what's fascinating here is that the early city designers, they seem to understand this link intuitively, long before we had the statistical tools to prove it.
They absolutely did.
In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the foundational design movements that gave us modern public parks were explicitly responding to this psychological and environmental distress.
They were. If you look at someone like Frederick Law Olmsted in the mid-1800s in the US, he wasn't just beautifying cities. He was designing the Emerald Necklace in Boston as a necessary relief valve
A relief valve for what?
for the psychological burdens of industrial life. He believed that the democratic, restorative nature of green space was just essential for public health. It wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity.
And we see that thinking formalized in movements like the Garden City, right? Championed by Sir Ebenezer Howard in England in the early 1900s.
Yes, Howard envisioned cities that explicitly escaped the stress and what he called the isolation of crowds.
He promised benefits like pure air and water, no smoke.
And my favorite, no sweating. He was escaping the oppressive city heat even back then.
It's easy to just dismiss Olmsted and Howard as, idealists of their time. But what does 21st century statistical analysis tell us?
It tells us they were fundamentally right. Modern empirical evidence dramatically affirms this historical hunch.
So the data backs them up.
Completely. Current research strongly connects nature contact to both climate regulation, so thermal comfort, and cultural services, which means mental well-being. We now have hard data showing that urban design decisions have a causal pathway to mental health outcomes.
And here's where the data becomes quite stark. Crank and Cosio highlight studies suggesting a direct, detrimental relationship between the sheer density of urban infrastructure, the concrete, the crowding, and mental health.
Right, and they focus on severe mental disorders. They use schizophrenia as a proxy, or as they term it, the canary in the coal mine, for broader urban psychological stress.
Okay, so why schizophrenia specifically? That seems like a big leap.
Well, they use severe outcomes like schizophrenia not because they think every city dweller is at risk of this specific illness, but because it acts as the most visible, the most measurable indicator of a generalized, pervasive urban stress.
A stress that everyone in the city is feeling, just maybe to a lesser degree.
Exactly. There are studies using birth records and census data that statistically analyze differences in schizophrenia incidence based on where you were born. The suggestion is that the urban environment, with its density and lack of restorative conditions, can increase certain mental health risks.
And when you look specifically at climate stressors, the link is, it's undeniable.
It is. The paper cites work from Crank and others showing that ambient air temperatures above certain thresholds are connected to increases in hospitalization risk for serious mental disorders.
How does that work physically?
The belief is that high air temperature disrupts the brain's delicate thermoregulatory function. It literally stresses the brain.
So whether a city chooses to pave a street in dark asphalt or plant a continuous line of shade trees isn't just an aesthetic choice.
It's literally a public health and mental health decision, which brings us to their central concept, thermal well-being.
That term is crucial because it goes beyond just feeling physically cool.
Right. Exactly. Thermal well-being is far more nuanced than just basic physiological comfort. It demands that residents have access to welcoming, comfortable, safe, and restorative thermal conditions.
Both indoors and outdoors.
Yes, even during dangerous atmospheric events. It's about having a place to go when the heat becomes threatening. And crucially, it must be equitably distributed.
Which it so often isn't.
And that's the point. If some communities lack safe, comfortable, or restorative places to retreat to when it's 105 degrees, that is a failure of thermal justice.
Okay, so we've established that the body and mind suffer when thermal justice fails. But now we face this cruel and profound irony. When cities finally try to fix this historical failure by investing in cooling infrastructure, those efforts risk becoming weapons of displacement. Let's look at the paradox of climate adaptation described in that Calderon-Argelich study.
This is the second article's main argument, and it is deeply challenging for anyone involved in urban planning.
I can imagine.
It argues that as cities invest heavily in climate adaptation, be it cooling infrastructure, new green space, or energy-efficient housing retrofits, these very improvements immediately trigger real estate speculation and rising housing costs.
Which means the solutions themselves lead to the socio-physical displacement of the historically marginalized residents the solutions were meant to protect.
Yes.
The very improvements that make the neighborhood physically healthier and more resilient also make it too desirable and too expensive, attracting wealthier residents and investment.
To study this, the Barcelona research team didn't just look back at what happened. They created a predictive participatory vulnerability index to map where gentrification risks were highest before major climate interventions occurred.
Predictive. So they're trying to get ahead of the problem.
Exactly. They used a widely accepted framework of vulnerability structured around three critical dimensions: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity.
That tripartite structure is critical for predictive mapping, so let's take some time to really internalize it. Why is this three-part structure, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, so effective at predicting this kind of risk?
Because it allows them to separate the physical threat from the population's ability to handle it.
Okay.
Exposure measures the physical threat and the features that attract speculation. Sensitivity measures the population's inherent weakness to the threat. And adaptive capacity measures the buffers the community has against the social shock of rising prices.
Okay, let's detail those indicators. For exposure, it's the degree to which an area is physically subject to climate pressures. So we're talking about higher surface temperature, air pollution, that kind of thing.
Yes, but also factors related to the built environment that signal an opportunity for profit,
Like what?
like the presence of older, less energy-efficient housing stock, which is ripe for lucrative value-adding retrofits. But here's the key paradox. They also included high green cover and proximity to parks as exposure indicators.
But wait, isn't the whole point of a park that it benefits everyone equally? Why would you categorize proximity to a park as an exposure risk factor?
Because in the context of gentrification, parks and green amenities are not just public goods. They are highly desirable features that increase property values and attract capital investment.
All right.
So the greater the exposure to these positive climate amenities, the greater the exposure to financial speculation. It's a bitter irony. The greener the area, the more vulnerable the residents become to displacement driven by the perceived quality of life improvement.
That's a chilling distinction.
Okay.
Now for sensitivity. This captures the inherent susceptibility of the population itself.
This moves beyond simple technical exposure. It includes socio-demographic factors like low median income, the percentage of family units living on rent, or households experiencing energy poverty.
And they also included a recent gentrification score, right? To see where the pressure is already building.
Exactly, to capture pre-existing financial pressure. These are the indicators that tell you who is least likely to weather a sudden rise in housing costs.
And finally, adaptive capacity. This is the ability of the population and the municipal resources to mitigate these pressures.
This is all about public protective resources. So the density of social housing units, the availability of public indoor climate shelters.
Libraries, community centers.
Yes, and the presence of community public services like libraries and social centers. High adaptive capacity means the community has built-in systemic buffers against displacement and climate shocks.
So if you have rent-controlled social housing, you're just far less vulnerable to the speculative ripple effect of a new park.
You've got a shield.
This framework makes the mechanism of displacement very, very clear. The study then identifies 4 specific pathways through which this heat gentrification manifests. Let's go through those slowly because understanding these mechanisms is crucial to designing anti-displacement solutions.
Certainly. Pathway 1 is the most direct. Greening interventions. This is where a major investment in green space, like a new park or extensive street tree planting, actively reduces the urban heat island effect.
Thereby attracting wealthier groups seeking that improved, climate-protected area, which leads to rent surges.
That's it. Simple cause and effect.
Pathway 2 is privatized resilience. Can you unpack what that term means on the ground?
It means the improvement happens only for those who can afford it, which leads to exclusionary results. Only higher income groups can afford to retrofit their existing homes with air conditioning, better insulation, or solar panels.
So they protect themselves in their current location.
Yes, while their less wealthy neighbors, who are often renters and older housing stock, continue to suffer from heat exposure. The market rewards private investment in resilience, making the thermal gap between rich and poor homes even wider.
Wow. Okay, pathway 3 involves public investments. The recommodification of retrofitted public social housing. I find this one particularly insidious because public money is often the catalyst for private pain.
Precisely. Public funds are used for rehabilitation, perhaps making social housing units energy efficient and climate adapted, which sounds great.
Sounds great, Bert.
But if the city or the management entity fails to legally secure the tenant's right to remain at the original affordable rate, those units become dramatically more valuable.
And they're often marketed again at higher prices.
at higher prices that exclude the original lower-income tenants. This results in what they call exclusionary resilience. We've seen it happen after large-scale retrofitting projects, for instance, in Paris.
And the final one, Pathway 4, describes the shift to the metropolitan periphery.
This is the gentrification ripple effect. Higher income groups, often seeking less density and more green space, especially post-pandemic, move away from the hot urban core to cooler, greener suburban or peri-urban areas.
And that movement drives up housing prices in those traditionally cheaper outlying areas.
Displacing existing vulnerable populations who relied on them for affordable housing and relative access to nature.
The Barcelona case study is just a perfect environment for this analysis because it already faces catastrophic heat risks, with high excess death rates predicted. By mapping vulnerability across over 2,000 census tracts, the study starkly confirms that historically marginalized populations are concentrated in dense, low-vegetation areas, facing compounding heat and displacement risks simultaneously.
They're getting hit from both sides.
Okay, we have our theoretical foundation from Kranken-Koseo and our displacement mechanism from Calderon-Argelich. Now we move to the core of this deep dive, taking these insights and running them through an intersectional lens to understand who is suffering and who is being pushed out. Let's start with class and the socioeconomic perspective.
The geography of disparity, it's not accidental.
Right.
It's the result of decades, even centuries, of environmental injustice. Crank and Koso will point out that historical planning decisions have created this deeply uneven distribution of cooling infrastructure.
And we see that so starkly in the U.S. context. The sources cite a study that showed lower-income Latino neighborhoods in Phoenix, Arizona, had measurably higher exposure to high surface temperatures compared to wider, wealthier neighborhoods just miles away.
The heat itself is a product of historical investment patterns.
Or lack thereof.
Or a lack thereof. But the Barcelona study moves past just physical exposure to analyze socioeconomic sensitivity to the displacement mechanism. When the research team used their participatory model, the community groups, they did not hesitate about the biggest drivers of vulnerability.
They knew exactly what they were.
They knew. They heavily weighted specific socioeconomic factors as the most relevant indicators for predicting climate gentrification.
Which ones specifically revealed the true pressure points for the working class?
Family units living on rent was assigned a huge weight, 19.4%, and energy poverty received an even larger weight, 27.8%.
Wow.
This tells us exactly who is caught in the trap. If you are a renter struggling with energy poverty, meaning you can't afford to heat or cool your home properly, you are exponentially more susceptible to climate gentrification.
Because if you're a renter, you lack the ownership leverage to resist increasing costs. And if you're in energy poverty, you definitely lack the financial resources to afford the inevitable rent hikes that follow neighborhood greening, or just the cost of moving.
Exactly.
The data connecting poverty to precarity seems just devastatingly circular here. Can you walk us through the life of a renter caught in this specific trap?
Okay, imagine you live in the example district in Barcelona. The study notes that average rental prices there surged by over 60% between 2014 and 2024.
60%.
That surge is already happening, just fueled by general speculation. Now, a greening initiative or a new, cool public space is announced nearby. That amenity instantly provides a powerful new argument for landlords to justify another, say, 10% rent increase.
On top of the 60%.
On top of it. So the renter, who's already struggling with energy bills in a poorly insulated apartment, that's the definition of exposure, now faces a rent increase driven by the very public good they were supposed to benefit from. They're forced out.
And it confirms that poverty and precarity aren't just conditions that make you suffer the heat. They are the indicators that predict who gets pushed out when the climate solutions finally arrive.
And this also circles back to housing quality, the retrofit trap we discussed. Older, less energy-efficient housing stock is an exposure marker because it's hot, but it's also an opportunity for profitable private renovations.
So a developer buys that stock, invests privately in energy upgrades, air conditioning, new windows.
That is privatized resilience in situ. The property is now cool and expensive. The tenant who is exposed to the heat is now exposed to the market and must leave, often ending up in an equally hot but cheaper neighborhood even further away.
So we're just shifting the problem around.
Shifting the problem and concentrating it. Moving to the racial justice perspective, Crank and Koseo make it clear that the roots of this inequality are deeply historical. The early 19th century greening movement, which gave us the parks we cherish today, was often driven by majority Anglo-led governments.
and it frequently served to entrench legacies of oppression and environmental racism. It was about deciding who deserved the amenities and where they would be placed.
Exactly. And that legacy persists. As they state, the current uneven distribution of urban forests means that communities of color are often more heat vulnerable compared to white communities.
Whether we look at Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where specific data show decreased canopy cover for Hispanic populations, or the low-income Latino neighborhoods of Phoenix, the mechanism of systemic exclusion creating unequal shade and unequal risk is universal.
The injustice just multiplies when you overlay that pre-existing heat vulnerability with the risk of displacement. The Calderon-Argelic study's participatory approach offers critical insight into this systemic sensitivity in the European context.
How so?
Grassroots activists, relying on their lived experience, assigned an extremely high weight, 19.4%, to the indicator, population born in global South countries, as a predictor of climate gentrification vulnerability.
That is a staggering weight, especially in an index focused on climate vulnerability. It means that simply being part of a migrant community from the global South is seen by activists as almost as powerful a predictor of displacement risk as being a renter.
It speaks to a structural exclusion that goes beyond just income. This demographic group is spatially concentrated in peripheral neighborhoods, like those along the Besós River in Barcelona, that are already high density and suffer from a persistent lack of investment.
So they face compounding risks.
Compounding risks. Greater heat exposure due to low canopy, high housing precarity, and systemic barriers that make them easier targets for displacement when the neighborhood improves. Their vulnerability is rooted not just in personal economics, but in systemic exclusion and racialized risk.
Where historical legacies dictate both who suffers the most from heat and who is easiest to displace when investment finally arrives.
That's it in a nutshell.
This leads us to one of the most surprising spatial findings from the Barcelona study: the geographic shift of vulnerability. Traditionally, we think of gentrification as focused on the desirable city centers. But their equal weights analysis revealed high vulnerability concentrated in the peripheral and outlying areas of the metropolitan region. Why are the suburbs or peripheries suddenly becoming the most vulnerable?
This is a critical finding because it demonstrates that gentrification ripple effect, pathway 4. These peripheral areas combine higher exposure to desirability factors. They're often cooler or greener, maybe near a river park with lower adaptive capacity.
So they have far fewer public services.
Far less social housing and fewer climate shelters than the urban core. Affluent groups seeking climate resilience in greener environments move to these less dense, attractive suburban areas, driving up costs and displacing the local populations.
So the core city of Barcelona, which has dense housing regulation and some existing social resources, shows medium to low vulnerability overall, but the risk is just diffused outward.
It's created a new, highly vulnerable line of climate injustice along the metropolitan edge, where people are geographically distant from public resources.
And this spatial finding is deeply intertwined with the policy failure revealed during the participatory mapping.
Yes, the deep disagreement over whether greening causes displacement. This highlights the problem of institutional silos.
This conflict really defines the policy problem. What was the typical practitioner view? The municipal staff focused on climate change and biodiversity.
They viewed gentrification as a separate structural challenge. It was a lack of social housing, and that was outside their environmental mandate.
It wasn't their job.
Not their job. They focused on providing technical, universal infrastructure like climate shelters and trees. As one practitioner noted, and I'm paraphrasing here, climate change means I need to plant more greenery. If this leads to gentrification, does that mean I shouldn't plant greenery? That's why I find this concept difficult.
So they saw their mandate as purely technical, reducing temperature, full stop.
But the activists saw a completely different reality. They assigned a high weight to proximity to parks as a direct exposure trigger, not just a benefit. They had lived experience that proved greening is a financial lever.
They had the receipts, basically.
Absolutely. One activist cited Barcelona's Super ILA, the Superblock pedestrian initiatives, as leading directly to rental increases of 50% or more nearby. For the activists, the moment an area gets quieter, cleaner, and cooler, the benefit of that green amenity is immediately capitalized into housing costs.
Making greening a direct agent of displacement.
It's a fundamental philosophical clash. Are you designing a cool street, Or are you designing an affordable neighborhood?
It seems like the core issue isn't the park itself, but the institutional structure that dictates who owns the land and who can set the rent.
Precisely. And this leads to the acknowledgement of the institutional silos. Crucially, both groups, the technical practitioners and the grassroots activists, they agreed on one thing.
What was that?
The fragmentation between housing agencies and environmental departments prevents coordinated strategies. Practitioners admitted that housing offices often don't even respond to invitations for joint strategic planning.
So they know the structural fix is housing policy, but they are stuck in environmental departments that can only plant trees.
Exactly, as another practitioner stated. For me, the main cause of gentrification isn't so much that you have improved that area. It's the fact that there are no housing policies allowing people to stay there.
The system itself is broken.
It's broken because the people responsible for reducing heat are siloed from the people responsible for keeping citizens housed. If you can't coordinate rent regulation with a greening project, you're simply subsidizing the displacement of your poorest citizens.
We must also expand our focus on vulnerability beyond the economic and geographic, specifically addressing accessibility and disability justice, which is so often overlooked in these climate discussions. The data, while it's thin, does provide some entry points here.
It does. The index's use of population aged over 75 years living alone as a key sensitivity indicator is really important.
Why that one specifically?
Because this indicator captures a population segment highly likely to have reduced physical mobility, limited social support networks, or chronic health conditions, all conditions that are exacerbated by extreme heat.
So if you are elderly and living alone, a sudden surge in housing costs is a threat to your social resources. But a prolonged heat wave presents a far greater life-threatening physical risk, especially if you have underlying respiratory or cardiac conditions that heat stress just makes worse.
And this feeds directly into the need for accessible thermal well-being, as defined by Crank and Cosio, a condition that must be safe and comfortable. For someone with reduced mobility, safety isn't just about the ambient temperature, it's about the pathway to cooling.
That means considering things like the quality of the sidewalks, the terrain and slope adaptations needed to even reach a climate shelter, and the presence of accessible public transit to move to a cooler zone. If the cooling infrastructure is only physically accessible to the young and mobile, it completely fails the mandate of thermal justice.
And the participatory policy recommendations that emerged from the Barcelona study stressed this exact point. Improving the physical accessibility of climate shelters, often by addressing terrain and slope issues. Furthermore, in a heat wave, individuals with chronic illnesses, which often correlate with age and socioeconomic status, they require a specific thermal stability that generalized green space might not provide. Their access to high-quality, air-conditioned public spaces is not a luxury.
It's essential medical support.
It's essential, and the fact that the most vulnerable populations often live in the oldest, least accessible housing stock makes this a compounding injustice.
Okay, we've analyzed the science of mental health and heat, and we've confronted the dark paradox of climate gentrification driven by these institutional silos. Here's where it gets really interesting. How do these dense, multi-layered findings inform the creation of spaces like the Feminist Park, which is designed explicitly for liberation, inclusion, and justice? The sources provide a clear mandate.
They validate the park's purpose, absolutely, but they also demand that its implementation strategy has to be revolutionary to succeed.
Okay, let's break that down. First, validating the need for nature and a mental health focus.
Yes. The need for a restorative, high-quality public space is absolutely validated by that Crank and Cosio paper. The park must be a psychological oasis.
It's not just a nice-to-have.
Not at all. The park's mission directly addresses the urban mental health crisis. We have strong empirical evidence that simply spending at least 120 minutes a week in nature is associated with improved health and well-being.
And it aids in physiological stress recovery.
It does. So the Feminist Park must maximize this restorative function, providing not just shade, but a sense of thermal well-being, a safe, comfortable, and restorative condition designed to counteract the mental strain of the city. It has to be a deliberate investment in the public psyche.
Okay, second point. Designing for thermal equity.
This is the locational imperative. The Feminist Park cannot be designed as a universal amenity if it seeks justice. It must deliberately counteract the historical legacy of environmental racism that created uneven tree canopy and high heat exposure in marginalized areas.
So if the park is built in an already wealthy green neighborhood, it just reinforces privilege.
It's just another green intervention that exacerbates pathway 1 gentrification risk. To achieve thermal equity, it must be strategically positioned in historically hot and underserved communities.
Literally making hot neighborhoods cooler and greener.
And the design must be deep, not just on the surface. Crank and Coseo emphasize that interventions must be ethically and culturally contextually designed. The materials used, the placement of seating, the type of shade provided, it all must reflect the specific cultural needs and contexts of the community it serves.
To ensure it's actually used and feels welcoming, not like some alien thing dropped into the neighborhood.
Exactly, to avoid the imposition of technical solutions that feel alienating or just don't function for local needs.
Okay, third, and this is the highest hurdle, mitigating climate gentrification risk. The Femis Park, by its nature as a desirable restorative green amenity, is a textbook trigger for Pathway 1 gentrification.
It is.
So how do we design for anti-displacement based on the Barcelona findings?
The primary lesson is that the implementation must be fundamentally coordinated with housing policies to secure the existing population before the amenity raises property values.
You have to solve the institutional silo problem. The park cannot be built in isolation by a municipal climate department.
That's the only way. The park's existence must be legally or functionally linked to immediate and aggressive rent stabilization measures or the expansion of social housing in the surrounding census tracts. The amenity must be paired with protection.
So what's the design principle here?
The design principle is strengthening community-based adaptive capacity. This means the feminist park needs to integrate social provisions into its function. It has to be more than just a cool spot.
It should integrate public services, accessible climate shelters, support centers.
Yes, especially for the highly sensitive groups identified in the Barcelona index renters, migrants, the elderly. The park becomes a protective barrier, a piece of critical social infrastructure, not just a physical space.
And finally, embracing the participatory model.
Yes. The process of creating the park has to adopt the collaborative methodology used by Calderon Argelish and their colleagues. We have to avoid that practitioner silo view and listen to the activists who understand the lived reality of displacement risk.
So the planning needs to incorporate deep, qualitative field knowledge from grassroots organizations alongside the technical input from designers.
That's the only way to ensure the design addresses structural inequalities, like housing precarity and systemic racism, and doesn't focus solely on technical metrics like air temperature or canopy cover. The participatory model ensures the vulnerability index you use for planning aligns with the real social risks experienced by the community.
That means accepting the activist view that green space is a potential trigger for displacement and planning accordingly, rather than dismissing gentrification as some unrelated structural challenge.
The feminist park must be the tool for structural change. It must integrate housing justice into its very foundation and demand that the municipal government break down those silos.
Okay, let's try to bring this all together.
If we summarize the core dichotomy here, it's this. Open design is intrinsically linked to our psychological health and thermal well-being. But climate adaptation measures, no matter how good they look on paper, are inherently a mechanism for displacement if they are not coupled with an aggressive housing justice framework.
And the thread is changing shape. The metropolitan scale analysis from Barcelona shows that gentrification risk isn't static. It's shifting to the periphery, where resources and adaptive capacity social housing accessible shelters are often at their lowest.
Which means city planners need to be thinking regionally, not just within the historical city limits.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, who cares about justice and resilience?
I think the knowledge gained today highlights that resilience cannot be defined purely through technical infrastructure, like cool pavement or a new fountain. Resilience must be defined through social protection.
Through securing the population in place and enabling their access to thermal well-being.
Exactly. The ultimate goal is not just a cooler city, but an equitable one.
And achieving that requires a complete overhaul of how municipal governance works. Both the administrative staff and the activists agreed that the main lever to fight climate gentrification is structural.
It's social housing units and rent regulation at the metropolitan level. The fragmented governance model, those institutional silos, they must be broken down to coordinate housing and climate policy immediately.
This calls for what you'd call transformative adaptation, right?
Yes, we must move beyond incremental fixes and address the foundational structural inequalities that dictate who gets shade and who gets priced out. If a city builds a park and the surrounding community cannot afford to stay and use it a decade later,
that park has fundamentally failed its mission of justice.
It has.
This leaves us with a provocative thought to mull over. If the ultimate metric for a successful climate adaptation project like the Feminist Park isn't how cool it gets or how beautiful it looks, but rather who gets to stay and enjoy it a decade from now,
Mm.
how should we fundamentally redefine the role of the urban designer in society?
Mm.
Should the urban planning mandate start with social protection rather than treating it as an afterthought that is the responsibility of a different silo department?
The design of a city is the design of its equity. And in the face of escalating heat, that design is literally the difference between health and displacement.
This knowledge is a tool, really. A tool for seeing your city differently and potentially for helping to change it.
It's been a really insightful deep dive, I think. This document provides such a vital framework, especially for projects like the Feminist Park Project that are trying to build something fundamentally different. It shows just how interlinked urban design and social justice are.
It really does. But it also shows the scale of the challenge, right? It requires sustained effort, real commitment, and a genuine willingness to shift power dynamics in how cities get made and managed.
Definitely. It makes you think about how we ensure those voices, the ones that have been excluded, are actually heard and centered.
Hmm. There's another quote from Sarah Ahmed that feels relevant here.
Go on.
She says, "If you have to shout to be heard, you are heard as shouting."
That's powerful.
It makes you ponder, doesn't it? How can the design of public space itself work differently? How can it amplify the voices of those who've been historically silenced, ensuring their needs are met without them having to shout just to be noticed?
How can design itself listen? That's a really provocative thought to end on.
A lot to think about.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.